She smooths the front of a navy shirtwaist dress, 1954, and the percolator is already bubbling in the kitchen. Before the day is out, she will wear this exact dress to scrub the floor, sit in a PTA meeting, and serve roast beef to her husband's boss. Nobody will notice. That is the secret. To understand why this system existed, you have to understand the world these women were standing in. The post-war years were not a time of easy abundance for most American families. The war had ended, yes, and the factories were humming again, but the memory of going without was still fresh in every household. Clothing was not something you replaced on a whim. It was something you managed, protected, and made work harder than it looked. The women running those post-war households had grown up during the Great Depression. They were children who watched their mothers turn flour sacks into dresses and resole shoes with cardboard. That experience did not evaporate when the economy recovered. It became woven into how they thought about every single purchase. A dress was not just a dress. It was an investment that had to earn its place in the closet many times over before it was allowed to wear out. During the war years, fabric rationing in the United States meant that women were legally limited in how much material a single garment could use. Skirts were shortened, pleats were eliminated, cuffs disappeared. Women adapted, as they always did, and they got very good at doing more with less. When rationing finally ended in the late 1940s, the habits it had drilled into an entire generation did not simply switch off. The thrift stayed, the ingenuity stayed, only the restrictions lifted. And then, in 1947, Christian Dior walked into that careful, restrained world and detonated a fashion bomb. His new look collection in Paris introduced long, sweeping skirts that fell to mid-calf, nipped waists, and rounded shoulders. It was lush, it was romantic, and it used an almost shocking amount of fabric. American women saw photographs in Life magazine and felt something they had not felt about clothing in nearly a decade. Pure, uncomplicated desire. The tension was immediate and real. Dior's new look required yards and yards of fabric at a time when most American homemakers were still thinking in terms of careful, measured cuts. A single full-skirted new look dress could consume 15 to 25 yards of material. For a household still operating on a depression-trained budget, that was not a casual purchase. It was a commitment. And so the question became, if you were going to invest in one beautiful dress, it had better do more than one job. Out of all of this, two core silhouettes emerged as the dominant shapes of 1950s fashion. Both were rooted in Dior's original vision, but they pulled in opposite directions. The first was the full-skirted Wasp-Waist Silhouette, that wide, swinging skirt paired with a dramatically cinched waist. The second was the slim-fitted pencil skirt, sometimes called the wiggle dress, which moved with the body rather than away from it. Together, these two shapes defined how every woman in America dressed for an entire decade. The full-skirted wasp-waist dress is the one most people picture when they think of the 1950s. The skirt began at a tightly cinched waistline and flared outward in a full circle or gathered sweep, often held out by a stiff crinoline petticoat underneath. When a woman walked in one of these dresses, the skirt moved with her in a way that felt almost theatrical. It caught light. It swayed. It announced her presence in a room before she had said a single word. That movement was not accidental. It was engineered. The pencil skirt, by contrast, was an exercise in restraint. It followed the line of the hip and thigh closely, narrowing slightly toward the knee, which gave the woman wearing it a particular kind of walk, small, precise steps, with a natural sway. It was considered sophisticated and urban, where the full skirt was considered youthful and domestic. Department stores marketed them differently. Women chose between them based on where they were going, what they wanted to say, and sometimes simply what the occasion demanded of them that day. Here is something that gets overlooked. Both of these silhouettes were actually ideal for the layering and transformation system that homemakers had developed. The full skirt had a waistline that could be dramatically reshaped by a wide belt, and its volume could be expanded or reduced simply by changing what went underneath. The pencil skirt, meanwhile, had a clean, simple bodice that accepted a jacket, a cardigan, or a scarf draped over it without any awkwardness. Both shapes were, in a sense, built to be transformed. Let us talk about the actual numbers for a moment, because they tell a story that surprises most people. The typical middle-class American housewife in the 1950s owned roughly 9 to 12 everyday dresses, not 50. Not 100, 9 to 12. Compare that to the modern American woman's closet, which research suggests holds well over 100 garments on average, and the contrast is almost difficult to believe. These women were not impoverished, they were intentional. There is a significant difference between those two things. The modern closet is, in many ways, a monument to anxiety. We buy a new dress for a wedding, a new blouse for a job interview, a new outfit for a vacation we have already taken photographs of in our heads. The 1950s homemaker operated from an entirely different premise. She started with the dress she already owned and asked what she could add to it, remove from it, or change around it to make it appropriate for wherever she needed to go. The closet was not a collection. It was a toolkit. There is a persistent myth about 1950s women and fashion, and it is worth dismantling directly. The myth says these women were passive, frivolous consumers who simply bought whatever Madison Avenue told them to buy and filled their closets with impractical prettiness. The reality is almost the exact opposite. These were women raised during the Depression, shaped by wartime rationing and running households on carefully managed budgets. They were not frivolous. They were some of the most resourceful clothing managers in American history. Dressing in the 1950s was not a casual act. It was a structured, technical responsibility with real social consequences. A woman who showed up to a PTA meeting in her morning house dress was making a statement she almost certainly did not intend to make. Getting the register of your clothing right meant signaling respect to your community, to your children's teachers, to your husband's colleagues. It meant being taken seriously. In a world where women had limited formal power, the way you dressed was one of the clearest ways you communicated who you were. So here is what I want to walk you through today. The 5-look system. One single dress, moved through 5 completely different social registers across a single day or a single week, with no one in the room ever suspecting that the woman standing before them in the evening had been wearing the same garment since she scrubbed the kitchen floor that morning. Each transformation used a different set of tools, each one sent a different signal, and each one required a specific kind of knowledge that was passed down without ever being written in a book. Look 1 is the morning chores register, and it is the most honest version of the dress. No jewelry, no layering, just the bare cotton dress worn as it was made, paired with a full utilitarian apron tied at the waist, white socks, and flat saddle shoes or loafers. This was a working uniform, and it was treated as one. The apron protected the dress. The flat shoes kept her steady on linoleum. The absence of jewelry meant nothing would catch on a cabinet handle or drag through a sink full of soapy water. Every detail was functional. The apron deserves a moment of its own because it was doing more work than most people realize. A good housewife apron in the 1950s was not a decorative afterthought. It was a full coverage garment that wrapped around the front of the dress and often tied at the back in a way that also shaped the waistline. It signaled to anyone who came to the door that the woman was working, that she was capable, and that her household was being actively managed. Taking the apron off was not just a practical act, it was the first transformation of the day. The white socks and saddle shoes of the morning chores look were not accidental either. Saddle shoes and loafers were the flat, practical footwear that kept a woman grounded and comfortable during hours of physical housework. White socks kept the shoes from wearing against bare skin through a long morning. But there was also something deliberate about the combination. It read as informal, domestic, and unpretentious. It was the visual language of a woman at home in her own house, not performing for anyone, simply getting the work done with quiet efficiency. By mid-morning, the chores are done and the grocery list is on the counter. This is where look 2 begins. The apron comes off and is hung on its hook by the back door. A cardigan sweater is lifted from the closet shelf and pulled on over the dress. The transformation is immediate and almost startling in its simplicity. The same woman who was on her knees wiping the baseboards an hour ago now looks entirely presentable for the butcher, the pharmacist, and the neighbor she will run into at the corner market. The dress underneath has not changed at all. Now, here is the detail that almost nobody talks about anymore, and it is one of the most clever small tricks in the entire system. Women in the 1950s frequently wore their cardigans buttoned backward, not inside out, just reversed, so that the button placket ran down the back instead of the front. What this did was create a smooth, clean knit surface across the chest and shoulders that completely covered the bodice of the dress underneath. To anyone looking at her from the front, she appeared to be wearing a knit top, not a layered dress at all. The dress had effectively disappeared. Here is the part that almost nobody talks about anymore. The backward cardigan was not an accident or a quirk. It was a deliberate practice technique that women passed to each other quietly, neighbor to neighbor, sister to sister. When you buttoned a cardigan from the back, the smooth knit front created a completely clean bodice line. The original dress neckline disappeared entirely. You were no longer a woman in a cotton shirtwaist. You were a woman in a neat knit top and skirt, and those were two entirely different social identities in 1954. Picture her stepping out the front door on a Tuesday morning, 1955. The cardigan sits smooth across her shoulders, buttoned neatly at the back where no one will ever see the closures. Her keys are in her gloved hand. Her purse is the same one she carried yesterday, but it is tucked under her arm at a slightly different angle. The neighbors on Elm Street see a composed, put-together woman running her errands. Not one of them suspects she is wearing the same dress she scrubbed the kitchen floor in 2 hours ago. By mid-afternoon, the Errand cardigan comes off and something more structured takes its place. This is the Civic Register, the look that says, "I take this community seriously, and I take myself seriously within it." The PTA meeting, the church auxiliary, the school conference. These were not casual gatherings in the social architecture of the 1950s. They were public performances of competence and respectability, and the homemaker understood that how she arrived communicated something before she ever opened her mouth. The dress is still the same dress, but the woman wearing it has shifted entirely. The tailored jacket was the single most powerful transformation tool in the 5-look system. When a fitted, structured jacket was layered over a plain cotton shirtwaist, something remarkable happened to the eye. The jacket's lapels framed the face. The structured shoulders created a silhouette of authority. The hem of the jacket hit exactly at the waist, making the skirt below read as a coordinated piece rather than the bottom half of a house dress. The entire composition now said two-piece suit, even when it was nothing of the kind. A woman who understood this could walk into a PTA meeting looking like she had dressed specifically for it. The hat deserves its own moment here, because modern eyes tend to dismiss it as mere decoration. It was not. In the social vocabulary of the 1950s, a hat worn to a civic event was a direct signal of respect, the equivalent of standing when someone entered the room. It said, "I prepared for this. I considered you worth the effort." A small pillbox, a simple felt cloche, even a modest fascinator pinned at a precise angle, each one communicated a level of intentionality that a bare head simply did not. Women understood this without anyone writing it in a rulebook. They just knew. Then came the short white gloves and the string of pearls, and these two items together functioned almost like a uniform insignia. The gloves were worn short, ending at the wrist, and they were almost always white or ivory. They covered the hands that had scrubbed dishes and wrung out mop water that same morning, and in doing so, they completed the transformation. The pearls, whether real or the far more common costume variety, added a quiet formality to the neckline. Together, gloves and pearls told everyone in that school gymnasium or church hall, this woman is here in her full capacity. She is not passing through. Step back and take in the full picture of what has happened. The same navy cotton shirtwaist that was covered by an apron at 7 in the morning is now, at 2 in the afternoon, reading as a structured professional suit to every eye in the room. No one at that PTA meeting is thinking she wore that same dress on Monday. They are thinking she looks put together, she looks prepared. The dress itself has not changed by a single thread. What has changed is everything surrounding it, and that surrounding architecture was doing work that the dress alone never could have done on its own. Now comes the most demanding transformation of the entire five-look system. The boss is coming for dinner. In the social world of the 1950s, this was not a casual arrangement. A husband's professional standing could genuinely be affected by the impression his home and his wife made on an employer. The evening hosting look had to communicate something the morning and afternoon looks never needed to: elegance. Not wealth, not extravagance, but a quiet, composed elegance that said, this household is a serious place, and the woman running it knows exactly what she is doing. The first tool for the evening transformation was the wide velvet belt. This was not the same fabric belt that came sewn onto the dress. This was a separate accessory, often in a deep jewel tone, burgundy or forest green or midnight navy, 2 to 3 inches wide and finished with a decorative buckle. When cinched tightly over the original dress belt, it did two things at once. It visually erased the daytime belt entirely, replacing it with something richer and more intentional. And it subtly reshaped the waistline, pulling the fabric in at a slightly different point and creating a new silhouette from the same raw material. Over the shoulders went the stole, and this single piece of draped fabric changed the entire emotional register of the outfit. A stole is not a jacket. It does not button or structure. It drapes, and the drape is the point. It softened the shoulders, covered the upper arms, and added a layer of visual texture and movement that a plain cotton dress simply could not produce on its own. When the stole matched the dress, which it often did in ways that will be explained in just a moment, the effect was of a carefully coordinated ensemble that looked far more considered and expensive than its actual origins would ever suggest. Here is where the story gets genuinely beautiful. When a homemaker cut a dress from a mid-1950s simplicity pattern, the cutting process left behind awkward triangular and curved scraps of fabric, the pieces that fell away from the main panels of a circle skirt or a fitted bodice. A woman raised on Depression-era thrift did not throw those scraps away. She gathered them, laid them out, and figured out how they could be sewn together into a long rectangle. Then she lined that rectangle with inexpensive rayon. She pressed it flat, finished the edges, and draped it over her shoulders. That was the stole, made from nothing, indistinguishable from something. The final flourish for the evening hosting look was the fake floral corsage, and this detail tells you something important about the psychology of the whole system. The corsage was pinned to the shoulder or the lapel not because it was required, but because it was original. Every woman on the block might own a navy shirtwaist. The corsage, the particular one she chose or made, was hers alone. Fashion historians who have studied this era note that women used decorative pins and fabric flowers specifically to add a note of individuality to what were often mass-produced or pattern-identical garments. The corsage said, I am not just wearing a dress, I made a choice. And so the boss sat at that roast beef dinner in that modest post-war house, looking across the table at a woman in what appeared to him to be a carefully chosen evening ensemble. The velvet belt, the matching stole, the corsage catching the candlelight. He saw elegance and composure in a household that ran itself with quiet confidence. He had no way of knowing, and no reason to suspect, that the dress under all of it was the same cotton shirtwaist that had been covered by an apron at 7 that morning. That invisibility was not an accident. It was the whole point. It was the craft. The fifth and final look required going deeper rather than adding more on top. Sunday Best was not about more accessories. It was about more volume, more movement, more presence. And the tool that delivered all three of those things was hidden entirely from view. Before the dress went on, before the shoes were chosen, before a single piece of jewelry was considered, a stiff crinoline petticoat was stepped into and tied at the waist. What happened to the skirt above it was immediate and dramatic. The fabric lifted, spread, and began to move in a way it had never moved on any other day of that week. A crinoline petticoat in its full 1950s form was not a delicate thing. It was constructed from layers of stiff nylon net or starched cotton organdy, sometimes 3 or 4 layers deep, each one cut in a wide circle and gathered onto a waistband. When a dress fell over it, the skirt was held out from the body at an angle that the fabric alone could never have achieved. The hemline lifted slightly at the sides. The skirt swayed with each step rather than falling straight. The entire lower half of the dress became animated, and that animation communicated something that a flat, unstructured skirt simply could not: occasion, celebration, intention. Then the heels went on, and this was the final calibration. Flat shoes and heeled shoes do not just change height. They change the entire mechanics of how a woman moves through a room. In flat saddle shoes, the stride is practical and grounded. In a 2-inch heel, the posture shifts, the shoulders pull back, the chin lifts, and the walk becomes a different kind of walk entirely. Combined with the crinoline swinging below, the effect was a complete physical transformation. The same woman who had padded across the kitchen linoleum in white socks on Monday morning now moved through a church or a living room with a presence that the week's earlier versions of herself simply did not have. Stand back now and look at what the crinoline and heels have done together. The navy cotton shirtwaist that began the week as a practical, flat, utilitarian garment is now swinging and swaying with every step like something lifted from a department store window display. The fabric catches the light differently because it is moving differently. The silhouette is rounder, fuller, more festive. The woman inside it is standing taller and moving with a deliberateness that the flat-shoed morning version of herself did not project. The dress has not been altered by a single stitch, but it has become, to every eye watching, a completely different garment for a completely different occasion. Pause here for just a moment and let the full accounting sink in. 1 navy cotton shirtwaist dress, 5 completely distinct social identities: morning chores, afternoon errands, civic engagement, evening hosting, Sunday worship. Not one neighbor, not one teacher, not one employer's husband saw the repetition. Not because these women were deceiving anyone, but because they understood something about clothing that the modern wardrobe has almost entirely forgotten. The garment is the canvas, and the accessories, the layers, the shoes, the understructure, those are the painting. You do not need a new canvas for every painting. You need to understand how to paint. Before going any further into the accessories themselves, it is worth spending a moment on the layer that came before the dress, the foundation garments, because without understanding those, the whole system makes only partial sense. The bullet bra and the crinoline were not merely undergarments in the 1950s sense of the word. They were architectural tools. They determined the shape that the dress would take before the dress had any say in the matter. A cotton shirtwaist worn over a bullet bra and a full crinoline was a fundamentally different physical object than the same dress worn over a modern bra and no petticoat. The foundation was the structure. The dress was the surface. The way foundation garments changed the drape of fabric was not subtle. When a bullet bra held the bodice fabric away from the body at a precise angle, the fabric fell from that point in a clean, unbroken line to the waist. Without that structure, the same fabric collapsed inward, and the silhouette became undefined and soft in a way that the era considered unfinished. The crinoline below performed the same function for the skirt. It held the fabric out at a consistent distance from the body, so every pleat and seam fell exactly where the pattern intended. The dress was not doing the work alone. It never was. The architecture underneath was doing most of it. It is important to pause here and be precise about what the wasp-waist actually was in the 1950s context, because it is easy to look back and misread it as purely a beauty standard imposed on women from the outside. It was that, yes, but it was also something more functional than that. The cinched waist was the architectural hinge of the entire silhouette system. Without it, the layering logic collapsed. The belt had nothing to grip. The stole had no waist to drape from. The whole modular wardrobe depended on that defined center point as its anchor. Now here is the detail I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is one of the most clever and most completely forgotten tricks in the entire 1950s wardrobe system. Many dresses of the early to mid-1950s were designed with detachable collars and cuffs. Not sewn in permanently, but fastened with small buttons or snaps so they could be removed entirely. A crisp white Peter Pan collar and a pair of matching white cuffs could come off the dress in under 2 minutes, and what you had left looked like a completely different garment. Here is how the cycle worked in practice. A woman would unbutton the white collar and cuffs on a Sunday evening after church. She would drop them into a small basin of cold water with a little bluing agent to keep them bright white, something women of that era used as a matter of routine in their laundry rituals. She would starch them stiff, press them with a hot iron until they held their shape like cardboard, and button them back onto the dress. By Tuesday morning, the collar sat higher, crisper, and brighter than the day the dress was made. The genius of this system was what it created in the eye of the observer. When a neighbor or a teacher or a guest saw that woman walk in, wearing the same navy dress but with a gleaming, perfectly starched white collar and fresh white cuffs, the whole garment read as newly laundered and newly pressed. The eye goes straight to the brightest point of contrast, and in a 1950s dress, that was always the white at the neck and wrist. The rest of the dress could be 3 days worn and nobody would notice, because the collar told them everything was fresh. It vanished, but it worked. That phrase feels exactly right here, because the detachable collar is one of those solutions so practical and so quietly brilliant that it simply disappeared when fashion moved on and nobody thought to write it down. By the early 1960s, the shift dress and the mod silhouette had no use for a Peter Pan collar. The whole category of detachable neckwear faded out of pattern books and out of memory. But for roughly a decade, it gave homemakers on tight budgets the ability to multiply the freshness of a single garment without multiplying the labor of washing it. To understand how all of this was possible on such a wide scale, you have to understand the dressmaking industry that sat underneath it. McCall's and Simplicity were not just pattern companies. They were, in a very real sense, the infrastructure of the American homemaker's wardrobe. By the mid-1950s, millions of women were purchasing tissue paper patterns for as little as 25 cents and cutting their own dresses from washable cotton fabric bought by the yard. The home sewing machine was not a hobby tool. It was a household appliance as essential as the percolator on the kitchen counter. Washable cotton was the chosen fabric of the post-war homemaker for reasons that were entirely practical. It could be laundered at home without a trip to the dry cleaner. It pressed beautifully under a hot iron. It held its shape through a full day of housework, errand running and an evening of hosting without wilting the way rayon or silk would. And crucially, it was available in an almost endless variety of prints and solids at fabric counters across the country for somewhere between 30 and 60 cents a yard. A full shirtwaist dress could be made for under $3 in materials if you already owned the pattern. Here is where the thrift and the craft intersected in a way that was genuinely beautiful. When a woman cut the main panels of a circle skirt or a shirtwaist bodice from a length of fabric, she was left with awkward triangular and curved scraps that most people today would simply discard. A 1950s homemaker did not discard them. She gathered those scraps, sorted them by size, and used them. Leftover fabric became covered buttons that matched the dress exactly. It became a fabric-covered belt buckle that transformed a plain gros-grain belt into something that looked custom-made. It became the raw material for something even more impressive. The covered button detail deserves a moment of its own because it solved a problem that every homemaker with a budget faced. A plain cotton dress with plain white plastic buttons read as exactly what it was, a homemade garment. But a dress with buttons covered in the exact same printed fabric as the dress itself read as coordinated, intentional, and expensive. It was the kind of detail you saw in boutique windows on dresses that cost 10 times as much. The covered button signaled that the maker had enough fabric left over to do this, which implied quality and abundance, even when the reality was careful planning and a good eye. But the dress itself, however beautifully made, was only the beginning of the system. The real wardrobe of a 1950s homemaker lived in a separate category entirely: her accessories. A wide cinch belt in black patent leather. A collection of silk and rayon scarves, in 3 or 4 colors that worked with everything she owned. A shallow drawer or a hat box that held 8 to 10 brooches ranging from a simple gold bar pin to a heavy rhinestone cluster that caught the light across a room. This was where the actual variety came from. The dress was the canvas. The accessories were the painting. The brooch, in particular, was used in ways that go far beyond what we think of as jewelry today. A woman attending a PTA meeting in the afternoon might take a modest brooch and use it to gather the neckline of her dress slightly higher and tighter, pinning a small fold of fabric at the center front. This raised the visual line of the neckline by an inch or two, creating a more conservative buttoned-up impression without altering the dress at all. It took 10 seconds. It required no needle and thread. And it signaled to every other woman in that room that the wearer understood the register of the occasion. And then there was the brooch used as camouflage, which is a word that sounds dramatic but is entirely accurate. Cotton fabric, washed repeatedly and pressed with a hot iron week after week, eventually fades. A spot on the left shoulder where the sun hit through the kitchen window. A small pulled thread near the bodice where a pot handle had caught. A woman did not discard a dress for this. She folded a lightweight scarf into a soft triangle, draped it over that shoulder, and secured it with a brooch at the point where the fading was worst. The scarf became a decorative element. The flaw disappeared completely. This is the distinction that matters most when you are trying to understand how this system actually worked. Modern culture tends to think of costume jewelry as decoration, something added to an outfit after the real decisions have been made. But for the 1950s homemaker, the brooch and the scarf and the belt were structural decisions. They were made with the same deliberateness that a builder uses when deciding where to put a load-bearing wall. Each piece was chosen not for how it looked in isolation, but for what it did to the garment it was attached to, how it changed the line, the register, the social message of the whole. The scarf deserves its own moment here, because it was probably the single most versatile item in the entire system. A 24-inch square of printed silk or rayon could be folded into a narrow band and tied at the neck like a ribbon. It could be opened flat and knotted loosely over one shoulder like a capelet. It could be folded diagonally and tucked into the neckline like an ascot. It could be tied around the waist over a wide belt to add a second color at the hip. Each configuration changed not just how the dress looked, but what occasion it was appropriate for. One scarf, four completely different social messages. By the middle of the decade, roughly 1954 to 1957, the accessory market had expanded to meet this demand in a way that was almost perfectly calibrated to the homemaker's budget and her system. Five and dime stores like Woolworth's and Kresge's stocked entire counters of wide cinch belts, rhinestone brooches, silk flower corsages, and printed scarves, all priced between 75 cents and $2. Department stores offered slightly more expensive versions of the same things. The industry understood, even if it never said so explicitly, that it was not selling accessories. It was selling the ability to multiply a small wardrobe into something that looked much larger. And then, toward the end of the decade, something arrived that quietly began to dismantle the whole Elegance system. The sack dress appeared in American fashion around 1957 and 1958, a loose, boxy, formless silhouette that hung from the shoulders with no defined waist at all. It was the opposite of everything the modular wardrobe had been built around. A wide cinch belt had nothing to grip. A fitted cardigan buttoned backward over it looked shapeless. The Peter Pan collar that had looked crisp and precise on a fitted bodice looked lost on a loose sack. The accessories that had done so much work for a decade suddenly had nothing to anchor to. Fashion curator Daniel Milford Cottam has noted something that captures this moment precisely. By the late 1950s, two women could walk down the same street, one in a tight-fitted sheath dress and one in a completely loose sack dress, and both would be considered equally stylish and equally current. That had not been true at the beginning of the decade, when the silhouette was unified and the system of accessories was built around it. The fracturing of the silhouette into two completely opposite shapes meant that the shared vocabulary of the modular wardrobe, the vocabulary that every woman had understood without being told, was beginning to dissolve. What the sack dress meant for the modular wardrobe logic was not just a change in hemline or silhouette, it was a structural disruption. The entire five-look system had depended on one central assumption, that the dress had a waist, and that the waist could be emphasized, hidden, reshaped, or transformed by what was layered over or cinched around it. Remove the waist from the equation, and the system loses its hinge. The cardigan trick stops working. The wide velvet belt stops working. The stole has no waistline to balance against. The five looks collapse back into one, and that one is just a woman in a dress. Before we move into the larger meaning of all of this, I want to address something directly, because it is a misconception that still clings to the image of the 1950s homemaker in popular culture. There is a tendency to picture these women as passive recipients of fashion. Women who simply wore what Vogue told them to wear and bought what the department store put in the window. The reality is almost the exact opposite. The women who built these five-look systems were active, strategic, and deeply informed about how clothing worked. They were not following fashion. They were using it as a tool, and they were very good at it. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew. That phrase carries real weight here because the five-look system was never codified in a manual or taught in a home economics class as a formal curriculum. It was transmitted woman to woman, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, in the way that the most durable, practical knowledge always travels. A young bride watched how her mother laid out the accessories before church. A new homemaker noticed how the woman next door changed her cardigan for a jacket before the PTA meeting. The knowledge was in the doing, in the watching, in the quiet accumulation of observation over years. Getting the register wrong was not a small thing. In a tight-knit post-war neighborhood, showing up to a PTA meeting in your Chores apron or wearing your Civic register pearls to scrub the front stoop sent a message you did not intend to send. These women understood, with a precision that was never formally taught, that clothing was a form of communication. It told your neighbors whether you respected the occasion, whether you respected them, and whether you understood your own place in the rhythm of community life. The consequences of misreading the register were social, not legal, but in a community where reputation was built slowly and lost quickly, social consequences were serious. A woman who showed up underdressed to a church auxiliary meeting was not scolded. She was simply noted. The quiet withdrawal of a returned smile, the slight pause before an invitation was extended. These women were not paranoid. They were reading a room that had real walls, and dressing correctly was one of the ways they navigated it with dignity and grace. There is a quiet intelligence in this that is easy to miss if you are only looking at the clothes. These women were not simply following rules. They were reading every situation they walked into and making a calculated, practiced decision about how to present themselves within it. That is not passivity. That is a form of social fluency that took years to develop and was passed from mother to daughter without a single written lesson plan. It lived in the body, in the hands smoothing a collar, in the eyes checking the mirror one last time before stepping out the door. Close your eyes for a moment and try to feel it. Sunday morning in a post-war American house. The smell of starch rising from a freshly pressed cotton collar, still warm from the iron. The slight crinkle of a stiff crinoline settling under a full skirt as a woman steps away from the ironing board. The sound of a brooch clasp clicking shut. These were not glamorous moments. They were quiet, practiced, deeply intentional ones. The preparation itself was a kind of ritual, and the women who performed it every week understood exactly what they were building. What this entire system reveals is something deeper than fashion. It reveals how these women understood the relationship between time and intention. They did not have unlimited clothing. They had limited clothing and unlimited ingenuity. Every transformation, from the chores look to the Sunday best, required planning the night before, maintaining the accessories, keeping the collars bleached, the belts pressed, the brooches polished. That kind of ongoing care is not a burden if you understand what it is for. It is a form of self-respect made visible, one careful layer at a time. Here in 2026, the fashion world has rediscovered something it calls the capsule wardrobe. Editors write about it in summer roundups as though it is a new idea, a modern corrective to the exhausting churn of fast fashion. But post-war homemakers were living this philosophy 70 years ago, not as a trend or a lifestyle brand, but as the only practical way to dress well on a limited budget in a world that expected you to look put together at every register of your day. The concept did not need to be invented. It only needed to be remembered. Fast fashion asks you to buy something new for every occasion. The 1950s model asked you to know your clothing well enough to make it new for every occasion yourself. That is not a small distinction. One approach treats clothing as disposable. The other treats it as an investment you are responsible for. The homemaker who owned 12 dresses and $500 worth of accessories was not being frugal in a defeated way. She was being precise. She knew exactly what she owned, exactly what it could do, and exactly how to make it do it. Marie Claire and Women's Wear Daily have both run 2026 retrospectives looking back at post-war American dressing with a new kind of attention. They are noticing what scholars of fashion history have argued for years, that the mid-century homemaker was not a passive recipient of whatever the department stores decided to sell her. She was an active, resourceful participant in her own appearance, making deliberate choices that modern editors are now framing as ahead of their time. The post-war woman was practicing sustainable style before the phrase existed. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. She knew that a wide grosgrain belt could completely reframe a bodice. She knew that a brooch, placed at the shoulder, could turn a plain neckline into an architectural statement. She knew that the right hat changed not just how she looked, but how she carried herself through a door. These were not vanity tricks. They were skills, passed quietly from woman to woman, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, in kitchens and sewing rooms and department store fitting rooms across post-war America. Nobody is suggesting you need to starch a detachable collar or sew a stole out of pattern scraps to get dressed in the morning. That is not the point. The point is the mindset underneath the method. These women looked at a single well-made garment and asked, "How many ways can I make this work?" That question, applied to a modern wardrobe, is genuinely useful. It shifts the focus from acquiring more to understanding better what you already own. That shift does not require a time machine. It only requires a little of the same attention they brought to a navy shirtwaist on a Tuesday morning. The deepest lesson in all of this is the difference between an accessory-first mindset and an outfit-first mindset. The outfit-first mindset says, "I need a new dress for this occasion." The accessory-first mindset says, "I have a dress that fits and flatters, and I need to understand how to dress it up or down for whatever comes next." The 1950s homemaker lived entirely in that second mode. Her investment was not in more dresses. It was in a carefully chosen arsenal of belts, scarves, brooches, gloves, and hats that could transform the dresses she already owned into something the occasion required. Somewhere right now, in an attic in Ohio or a spare bedroom in the South, there is a navy shirtwaist dress folded in a cedar chest. Maybe it belonged to your mother. Maybe to her mother before her. It does not look like much when you unfold it. Plain cotton, a simple cut, a few covered buttons down the front. But if you know what you are looking at, you are holding 5 different women at once. The one who scrubbed the kitchen floor. The one who sat in the PTA meeting with her gloves folded in her lap. The one who smiled across the dinner table at her husband's boss and looked to every eye in the room like she had dressed for the occasion especially. The attic remembers even when we forget. What I want you to take away from all of this is not a set of styling tips. It is a feeling of genuine respect for the women who lived this way. They were not making do. They were making something. Out of a post-war budget, a Depression-era inheritance of thrift, and a culture that expected them to look polished at every hour of the day, they built a system of such quiet elegance and practical intelligence that we are still, 70 years later, rediscovering its logic and calling it new. They deserved more credit than they received, and they still do. If this video brought back a memory, a dress your mother kept, an accessory your grandmother never went without, a trick you watched her do at the vanity without understanding why, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me what she kept in her closet. Tell me what she wore to church. Those stories are exactly what this channel exists to hold on to. If you are new here, subscribe and come back, because there is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, and we are just getting started pulling it into the light.